Okay, so for today's big picture lesson, and this one is really important because we are going to see a lot of revolutions as we go through this class. China, France this week, Haiti, America, Russia. And so I really want to start off with the big question to really ask, which is, why do revolutions so often start with images like this one, which are, this is people jumping up on tanks in like the late 1980s with the fall of communism. And, things start off so peaceful and, and relatively calm, but so often they end up like this, where you have guillotines in the Reign of Terror. This is a Louis XVI execution commemorative plate. And so what makes them go so off the rails? And that is what we're going to talk about today in our lesson on stages of the revolution. And so this model, I will add to the course materials a one-page diagram of this, which you may want to follow along with as you listen. But we'll talk about these stages of a revolution. So this model was come up with by a historian named Crane Britton in the 1930s. Now, what he came up with for this model was that there's a way revolutions go. And when you're going to look at a regime that is going to start with a revolution, okay, it's going to have certain challenges. And so one of the first things to look for is the revolution is the old government. That's what old regime means. It's going to be economically weak. So what problems is it going to have? Now, specifically, the revolution, each country is different. But for example, in France, they had this, let me just change the color here. In France, they had this weak tax structure that was unfair. And ultimately, the government was just bankrupt. And when you look at, we got Tsar Nicholas off to the right there. Okay, the Russia had not industrialized. So the specific economic problems can be a challenge, but ultimately the government is going to just not have the resources it needs. And that is going to cause a challenge because obviously if a government doesn't have the resources, it can't provide the things that a country needs. Now, the next element you're going to have is going to be politically weak. Now, it doesn't actually mean that the leaders themselves are like ruthless, because one of the interesting things is revolutions don't happen under ruthless people. So like somebody like Adolf Hitler was not going to have a revolution against them. What actually politically weak here means is that the leaders are indecisive and just not effective. And so, for example, Nicholas over there in 1917, he was indecisive. Rasputin had sort of taken over kind of the royal family. And that was a challenge. Louis XVI was cut from the same cloth, tended to agree with the last person in the room to talk to him. And all of those mean that you're just not going to have somebody people respect. And that is a big problem. Okay, and so the leadership will be relatively useless. Now, one of the harder concepts to get our head around is called intellectual's dessert. Now, that doesn't mean like what the smart people have for lunch. What intellectual in this sense means, it means that influential people, sorry, I can't spell, well, it's bad handwriting, but influential people. And a lot of times, like in the 1780s, this is writers. Now it might be like celebrities. Those people have basically abandoned the government. and they are withdrawing their support. So they will write anti-government things. And just will generally not be supportive. Okay, and because they have influence, that matters. Now, the last element you have are what are called class antagonisms. And this just means that two or more groups in the society do not like each other. And they are going at each other. So, for example, in America, it was patriots and Tories. In France, you had the first and second estate against the third estate. In Russia, it was the communists against what was called the bourgeoisie, etc. So let's take a look at what an example of economic weakness might look like. So this is the budget of France in the 1780s. Okay, specifically 1786. The revolution was 1789. So what do you notice when you see the problem? Well, the heart of Louis's problem is that he's only taking in 472 million livres, and he has an output of 600, or he's spending 633 million. So that leaves him a deficit of roughly 161 million or so. So what's the problem? Right? Well, you can't keep running that deficit. And I know we talk about deficits in America, but I'll show you why it's not a huge problem in America yet. So one of the symbols of Louis, what angered people so much, they saw the Palace of Versailles and what Marie Antoinette spent. And what they would notice is, let me just turn off alerts here. What they would notice is, well, geez, Louis, you are spending so much on those palaces, and look what's going on. But really, it was only 7% of his money that was actually being spent on that, but it was so visible. If you actually look at what his biggest problem is, it's actually this piece of the pie, which is the interest payments on the debt. So he was owing so much money. He already had 41% of his money. So 40 cents of every dollar he takes in is already gone by the time he spends it. And the problem with that is when you get to that big a percentage of your income going for debt relief, is that you don't have money to spend on anything else. So you have to borrow money, and then that just increases this piece of pie for the next year. So really, the solution for Louis, he had to change this side of the equation. So he had to change the 472. The problem was, and this goes back to the economic weakness and his political weakness, he was not willing to tax his friends, the other nobles. And we'll get into this more specifically, but they weren't paying taxes. And so that becomes a problem. Because really the solution when you have a deficit like this is you have to both raise taxes and, or somehow generate more income, and cut your expenses. You can't do it both ways. You can't do it with just one way or the other. So that's just an example of how that works. Okay. Now, here is an example of intellectuals deserting. And this is a cartoon from France in 1789 on the eve of the French Revolution. So what you can see in this particular cartoon, okay, is you have a rock here that says the tie. Now the tie was this particular tax that was only paid by the lower classes in France. So in the French Revolution, again, you'll read about this, they had three groups. So they called them estates. And so you had the first estate was the clergy or the church. They didn't pay taxes. Your second estate was the nobility. Also didn't pay taxes. And then everybody else. So this is maybe the clergy's like 1% of the population, roughly. The nobles are 2%. And the rest of the population is what was called, let me just change pen color, was called the third estate. Now the third estate encompassed actually both like the homeless people, your poorest person in France, and your rich people, or your rich merchants. So like today, Bill Gates and you would be in the third estate. But in particular, you can see the message of this cartoon, which was published, is that the rock representing the tax is crushing the members of the third estate. And that's an example of intellectuals deserting because, cartoonists are writers, and they are speaking out against the regime. Okay, so once you have all the ingredients for a revolution in place, okay, some things are going to happen that are sort of going to bring that to a boil. Now, sometimes these are planned, sometimes they're not. But one of the key things that can happen is you'll have what's called a symbolic action. So this is something that the country or the people can rally around. And sometimes it's planned, but very often it is not. But whatever it is, it will inspire people and, just serve as like a remember the Alamo moment. So let me just give you a couple examples of this. So in France, the big moment was, we already talked about with the storming of the Bastille, where they didn't really plan to go to the prison, but they did, and then it became a symbol of the king's power. Another big symbolic moment we'll talk about was after the king tried to lock out what was called the Estates General. The delegates refused to go home, and that was called the tennis court oath. And they basically said, we're not going anywhere. More recently, a good example of a symbolic action was in Tunisia. And this is what started the Arab Spring, a wave of revolts that led to changes in some countries and just catastrophic civil wars like in Syria and others. But the symbolic action there, this is, I think, about 2013. What happened in Tunisia was the leader had been there for a while, and he was kind of corrupt, not really a bad guy, not particularly ruthless. But there was a fruit vendor who was just trying to make enough money, it's a really sad story, to just be able to marry his girlfriend. And every day he would get shaken down by this policeman who demanded basically protection money. And he could barely afford it. And we're talking maybe, 10, whatever it was, very small amount of money. But eventually he just couldn't take it anymore. And so out of frustration, he actually went in front of the police station where this person worked. It was actually a woman. And he lit himself on fire as a means of protest. He just had nothing left. And he actually died from that. But that protest just crystallized how everybody in the country was feeling, or lots of people. And that just triggered the revolt. And again, that doesn't always happen, but like that for Tunisia, and that just sparked a wave of things. So that is one phase. Now, the next phase that can happen is where planning. Now, this can be either before or after the symbolic actions. That really just depends on just variety of circumstances. And a lot of times it will happen if it depends if it's caught the people off guard. And so these are where the groups that have been thinking about the revolution before now really get mobilized and decide that they are going to go all in. And they just will. So like I said, so in France, this was where like the National Assembly began to write laws. In Russia, they were just caught really off guard by this in 1917. And so like the communists began planning the provisional government. We'll talk about all that later. It really just can very much depend on what's going on. And then lastly, you're going to have what's called the role of force. So what this means is the old regime is going to decide that, okay, enough is enough. You kids are out of control. Go to your room. So they will try to crack down, and it's not going to work. Now, some revolutions will have this happen. And if it works, then it's just a rebellion and we don't have a revolution. But if it doesn't, then you are in full-blown revolution. So, for example, in France, Louis XVI tries to call out his army when they're storming the Bastille, and they join the protesters. And at that point, he sort of caves. In Russia in 1917, the Tsar Nicholas, he called out to shoot bread rioters, and they joined the protesters. So it really just depends. Now in Syria, they tried a revolution recently, in the part of the Arab Spring, and ultimately the leader, Bashir al-Assad, he was actually able to, took a civil war, and they crushed it, and that was very recently that came to an end. So that's really these things. They don't always happen necessarily in order. Sometimes the symbolic action is the role of force, like in France. It can all just depend. So here is a good example of a symbolic action, okay, where this is what was called the Boston Massacre in 1770. Now, this really was precipitated by the colonists, actually, these little thugs here. They were actually heckling the British soldiers, and then accidentally the British soldiers actually fired into the crowd. But this engraving by Paul Revere really immortalized it, and he even called it the Boston Massacre. But there's many, many distortions. So, for example, you can see the copious amounts of blood. This is definitely a propaganda. The fact that the colonists are not armed when in reality they had rocks and sticks. The massacre was also happened on a snowy night. And of course, in the drawing, it's daylight. But again, people believed this version, and so that was your symbolic action. Now here, this is the tennis court oath, which I mentioned before. And again, this is a painting done after the fact, but it really is done to show how important it was. You have the delegates to what is going to be the National Assembly standing up. This happened actually was on an indoor tennis court. I'll tell that story when we talk about the French Revolution, but here you see the oath takers, and it's just very, very symbolic and trying to make that point. Lastly, we have the storming of the Bastille, and here you can see the soldiers helping the crowd fire on the crowd, the towers of the Bastille, the noble peasants and Third Estate charging in, and that is just how symbolic actions work. Now, once you have the role of force, you are no longer in a rebellion, you are in a revolution. And things are going to go really fast and very often proceed beyond what the people, causing them intended. You can compare this to kind of a snowball starting to roll down a hill, like in the old Looney Tunes cartoons. So, first it's going to start with what's called the rule of the moderates and dual sovereignty. Now, this isn't always dual sovereignty, but in the revolutions we're looking at, it mostly is. It's where the old government, realizing it's in trouble, tries to work with the new government. And this will have varying degrees of success. Usually the old government will give concessions to the new government, but again, usually it's under duress and it doesn't always work that well. But like I said, it can just vary. Pardon my writing a little slow here. So as examples, okay, in France, they tried to work with the king. Okay, so they in effect created a constitutional monarchy. Now, in some revolutions, this doesn't happen. So, for example, in Russia in 1917, they just tossed out the old government. So each little revolution is slightly different, but the point is it's not all that radical just yet. Okay, now, when the moderates take over, they're going to do just a couple of things they've got to deal with. First thing is they've got to write a new constitution. So what are the new rules? And this will, depends how radical. Sometimes it's a big change. Sometimes it's an incremental. But they are trying to put in place what they have going on. Okay, and usually this part's going to be peaceful. So in France, this was the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which we will learn about. Rights of Man. And it was also, they also actually wrote a constitution as well. Okay. Now, the next thing that'll happen is these radicals are there's going to be usually a war. Now, this can be caused by two things. Sometimes the radicals start the war because they are so convinced that they are awesome and look what they did in their country, that they will take on all comers. Okay. Other times, other countries that are not happy about what's going on, they may attack them. And it just depends on the particular revolution. So, for example, again, in France, they attacked their rivals, but the rivals, like Austria and places like that, but they didn't, the rivals were kind of spoiling for a fight too. But France really wanted to spread their revolution. And you can sort of fall into that trap of believing your own hype. So anyway, that is here. You could argue that in the American Revolution, this was after Lexington and Concord. So all just depends on what you have going on. Okay, and there's a look at all the various texts. So just to recap, you have the old government, tries to work with the new government, but people around them, after they write that constitution, aren't happy. Or the revolutionaries want to spread what they've done. So either way, it leads to some trouble. Now in phase 4, this is where the revolution starts to go off the rails. And no matter how much you have tried, it's really hard to have half a revolution. And so what will happen is, you will have people, and you even see this playing out, I think, in some of our politics now, is people will feel, parts of the revolutionary, we'll say some people, will feel that things haven't gone far enough. And that will cause some trouble. Because they will want to push the revolution even further than the people that started it. So what'll typically happen is the movement, or just the revolution, will be taken over by extremists and people who are just willing to go all in. So as an example, okay, in France, this is what happened when what were called the Jacobins, these really radicals who ultimately wanted to get rid of the king completely versus constitutional monarchy, they sort of seized power and they purged out of the assembly all the moderates. Okay. Other revolutions in Russia, for example, this is when the communists seized power. So again, can all just vary, and change. But that is a big deal. Now, once these radicals take power, well, how are they running things? This typically can go a couple ways. Usually, it's a small group that is going to do it. And sometimes there is just one key leader. And again, that will just depend on who it is. So in the French Revolution, it was a guy named Robespierre. In Russia, it was Lenin. But again, it will just depend on what size of group you have and such. Okay, so phase 5 is really simultaneous, or it's right after phase 4. But right after the radical seize power, you are basically on your trip to Crazy Town now. And this is where, when we think of revolutions, things just go nuts. Now, a lot of this just happens because the revolutionaries need people to buy into what they're doing. So forced conformity means they basically you have to obey the revolutionary rules. And they will create new rules. That's what conformity means. So, for example, let's go through some revolutions. So in Iran in the 1970s, this is when they brought in Islamic law, where women had to wear the veil, etc., or the Taliban in Afghanistan. Okay, in France, even though they had a constitution that guaranteed rights, this is where they had the guillotines. And anybody that was not revolutionary enough got the chop. In Russia, this is when the Bolsheviks did purges, and they would weed out anybody that was not sufficiently communist enough. And it all just depends. But this and the ways people will do it, they will all use really extreme laws. So when you read about France, I'm not sure how much detail they'll go into in the book, but they had things like you could be convicted without evidence. You could be sentenced the same day you were put on trial, and things like that. So now the next thing that's got to happen is you got to get the word out, because you are believing your own hype and you're so awesome. So people will try to tell others, well, let me just get my box straight, how awesome our revolution is. And the ways you can do this can really vary, but you've got to get the word out. Now, you can do this a few ways. A lot of it comes down to propaganda. So a lot of the paintings I showed you from France, those were done actually during the radical phase, because you're trying to show how awesome your revolution is. And again, it can Joseph Stalin did it with photographs and doctoring photos. You can push for revolutions in other countries, so you can sponsor groups outside of your country. They did that in America with the Communist Party, things like that. But either way, this is also going to make people really, really nervous. So it kind of goes with forced conformity as well. Now, ultimately, what is the causes of all these terror? Why do revolutions go this route? And ultimately, it comes down to this, is that the revolutionaries are insecure about their gains. And they are feeling threatened. And a lot of times, this is caused by the war from their moderate phase. So, Usually, yeah, very often this is caused by, your war going badly. In France, that was the case. Setbacks, things like that. And so there you go. Okay. Now, just some examples we can see of sort of forced conformity reigns of terror. After the storming of the Bastille and after the French had written a constitution, a bunch of pissed off women from the fish markets got so outraged at some rumors about what Marie Antoinette had been doing that they stormed out to Versailles. This is the Women's March, and they actually butchered her guards. She fled for her life and was only able to get to be saved because she had a little secret hidden door in her bedroom. Here's a picture of it, and you can see, and she fled to Louis XVI's bedroom. And at that point, the mob here, after killing the guards, put the guards' heads on the end of the pikes, you can see right here, and they marched Louis and Marie back to Paris, and they actually never ever went back to Versailles. So that's an example. And of course, here is the ultimate symbol of the French Revolution, the guillotine. They actually had a nickname for this in the Revolution. They called it the National Razor. And as we talked about, it was really an Enlightenment device, but didn't quite work out that way. Now, here is some of the outside reaction to some of the craziness. So this is a cartoon from England called From the Pinnacle of Liberty. And what it shows is you've got let me just change colors here. You got a French revolutionary, that's kind of the hats they wore, and he's standing on top of a dead priest and showing how great liberty is. And what's kind of gross, he's actually taken a dump into his hat while he watches the guillotine here. And really, it's just kind of a mocking of the idea of this is what liberty is about. So the last phase of a revolution is called the cooling off period. Crane Britton in his model compared it to like a fever, and it breaks. So you can't stay crazy forever. So you have what's called first recovery from the revolution. And, you just can't sustain a reign of terror. So what happens here is something will happen to kind of break the spell. Now, I compare this where I sometimes call it an emperor's new clothes moment, where somebody will stand up and say, this is nuts, what are you doing? Sort of like in a mass hysteria. The other thing I should have mentioned in the previous phase is that the reigns of terror very often are mass hysterias, where you've got all the same ingredients, and so this is kind of like that breaking. So in France, for example, it's where Robespierre, our radical head, he is actually taken down and killed by his fellow Jacobins, who are just terrified that he's going to be going after them. So that's one. And then the question is, once you've gotten rid of that, you've got a couple routes you can go with revolution, really two. So one is amnesty. So are you going to forgive the people that really did the bad stuff, so the repressors, or do you want your pound of flesh? And do you go all in on revenge, or in some cases, like in Russia, you just end up with a really strict dictatorship, and who just ends up being worse. So that is, for example, in Russia, where you get Joseph Stalin. If you've read the book Animal Farm, it is very much following this. So that it can really just depend on what kind of leader you end up with. Now, then at some point, people are going to return to what you'd say is the status quo. Now, what this means is status quo is Latin for the way things were. But you don't usually go back to just everything being totally normal. Usually, there are some changes that will keep. And it's sort of like you go back to a new normal. And so very often this is what you wanted in the original moderate phase. So in France, for example, they never are really going to go back to the king, no matter what. Even though they end up with Napoleon as a dictator, he still brings in changes. And even after Napoleon's gone and they bring in another king, it's just not the same. Russia never goes back to the Tsar, even with Joseph Stalin. So, as an example, here is the death of Robespierre in the French Revolution, as an example. And in fact, what they don't show in this, he actually had kind of a fitting ending for someone as awful as he was. So when they actually go to execute or to arrest him, there's a scuffle in the room, and it's unclear whether he did it or one of the enemies, and he basically blows off half his jaw gets destroyed. So he spends the last hours of his life in excruciating, horrible pain before they drag him out the next day to the guillotine as the cheering crowds cheer on his death, which is kind of like how you want your villains to go down. So a few things about this model I just want to mention before we end the lecture is the model isn't always perfect. Sometimes you'll have phases. Some don't last as long as others, depending on the revolution. So, for example, like in the Iranian Revolution, the moderate phase lasts maybe a month. Or sometimes the radical phase might not be that radical. So if you think about the American Revolution, it sort of follows this model, but we don't do mass guillotinings of British citizens. And our, radical phase, you would argue, is, well, we write the Declaration of Independence. So one of my theories on that is, I think you can argue that revolutions are a bit like a spring. Let me just take away some paper here. And so, for example, you have a spring, right, which basically coils. And if you push down on the spring, you can make it really tight. But eventually, you're going to have to let that spring go. And when you do, the spring is going to go back up. And the question is, how much force is the spring going to rebound with? And that is kind of how violent your revolution is. So if the government before was really repressive, they're going to be pushing down on that spring with a lot of force, and it's going to bounce back up hard. On the other hand, like in our revolution, the British were not all that bad and generally pretty nice guys. So our bounce back wasn't that horrible. I once actually asked one of the chief justices of the South African Supreme Court, who was involved in their revolution, why South Africa didn't go that way. And he said if early on you can take control from the street mobs and keep the people from going crazy, that can set a tone. So you could argue that in something like France, where the violence got out of hand early and you didn't stop it, that caused trouble. So you can think about where this model applies, where it doesn't. Just as a thought possibility, I would argue that the Republican Party in the last really 20 years has been going through a revolution, with Donald Trump being right now, they're in the middle of their reign of terror. So it started with impeaching Bill Clinton as kind of wanting to get rid of this old guard and Newt Gingrich going into power. Then you had really with Sarah Palin in 2008 and sort of demonizing Muslims. But John McCain at that point was still standing up to it. But then with Trump, they've just gone all in. And anybody that stands up to President Trump ends up getting voted out of office. So at some point that's going to pass. That's what certainly Joe Biden hopes. But right now, I don't, that's not where it is at right now. So we'll see at what point that revolution cools off. So hopefully this model helps as you look at the revolutions this week. Another point I want to make about revolutions is to sort of explain where these stages of the revolution might fit in terms of the political spectrum. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the political spectrum, where you have, on the far left, you have in radical, you have people wanting just enormous amounts of change. And on the right side, you have reactionary and conservative people that don't want much change, or to even turn back the clock. So a way to think about this is when a revolution starts, it's like a pendulum. And so the pendulum at the start of a revolution, of course, is going to be all the way to the right because, there's obviously not much change, hence the revolutions. That'd be like the old regime. Now, as the revolution gets going, the pendulum starts to swing towards the left. So your moderate stage is going to be somewhere going towards the middle. But the problem with pendulums and revolutions is you can't stop them. Gravity takes over. So eventually that pendulum is going to swing and your radical phase is going to be here, where you have your reign of terror and who knows what else. Now, eventually you can't sustain that. So the pendulum will then, as is normal for pendulums, it's going to start to swing back. Now, as that pendulum swings back, the real question is going to be how far back a swing is it going to make? So you could end up here, back in the moderate phase, where you have some of the changes you wanted at the beginning, but you get rid of the crazy stuff. Or in some revolutions, you go all the way back to the right and you end up with as bad a dictator as you could. And that can happen with like Joseph Stalin. They do bring back absolute monarchs in France. But what really is more likely is you end up with, notice my second political spectrum model down here. So what's much more likely is where the whole spectrum shifts. And so what was considered moderate change before is now sort of your old regime. And the pendulum sort of resets itself. And then what was considered pretty far left of change might be considered, moderate change now. And who knows what your new far left is, but it might be something else. And what's really unheard of is to go back to whatever the way things were before. So the whole center of gravity shifts. And you see this in lots of revolutions where you sort of have a new normal.